So now we do have some questions in the chat. We have about 10, maybe 15 minutes since we started a few minutes late to go through some of these questions. And so if you and Professor Dunn are ready, I'll just kind of start going through some of them. So the first one is actually directed towards Professor Dunn uh, from Sandeep Jain, who you can read his commentary there. But the question is, can the balance between jiva, the soul, and ajiva, everything that is not soul, provide the ethical framework we need to change how we be in a world of overconsumption? Furthermore, can this specific philosophy work in harmony with other religious views?
Wow, tough question, but good question. Thank you for that. And I'll just give it from my understanding. In Mahavir's teaching, ahimsa and parigraha don't quickly clear karma. They very gradually stop new karma and help remove old karma through disciplined practice. But the jiva ajiva distinction in Jainism can support a strong ethic against overconsumption. But because all life is ontologically real and vulnerable, it pushes you towards a strict non-harm, reduced consumption sort of thing. But in practice, what we see is that most societies don't adopt it fully, and its principles can still shape simpler but less exploitative ways of living. Um, I'm not sure what else I can say about the jiva and ajiva. Um, as far as harmony with other traditions, there's definitely overlap at the ethical level, even if doctrines differ. And that's why in my presentation, I said I'm applying Anekantavada from specifically to environmental ethics, not to those theological questions of ultimacy. I feel like that those sorts of things are kind of above my pay grade, and maybe those are better questions for someone like Dr. Melanie Barbato, who's been doing comparative theology through this frame. But I'm always looking for the shared frameworks and shared ethics. So shared nonviolence, and Hinduism, of course, shares, the karmic frameworks, although karma is often redefined as I understand it by these traditions. Even my own tradition of Christianity has very strong parallels in terms of asceticism and stewardship, although we're tending to move away from the language of stewardship towards custodianship. And that might sound like it's just a kind of a little shift in terminology, but I think there is some good scholarship there. But for me, the common ground is always ethical, not really metaphysical. But that's my that's I guess what I try to use as my approach. Thanks for that. I'll have to think more about the Jiva and Ajiva question.
Thank you, Professor Dunn. And maybe now I'll just pivot over to Professor Kalmanson, just because there is one or a couple of questions in there in the chat. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to read them yet. From Sandeep Jain, who also asks to you, uh, you said that I think I'm not sure exactly how you said this. They love to hate the duality or something along these lines, right? And I won't read the entire thing, but I'll go to the question and you can answer it to the extent that you like. Why do critics of duality create new frameworks instead of embracing duality? And what might Anekantavada miss that we need to use absolute truth, which doesn't exist?
That's a fantastic question. I don't know if I have the full answer here. I mean, I will say I kind of made a joke at the last American Academy of Religion that I'm sort of outing myself as some sort of dualist now. But I really, if you look at my CV up until now, all I've talked about are relational ontologies, process philosophies, vital materialism. I mean, this has been my work has been rooted in a kind of a driven by a kind of a non-dualist sensibility and philosophy. I wrote my dissertation on Zen Master Dogen, right? And so I was part of the crew who have been sort of using him as a paradigm case of this kind of non-dualist outlook. And so there's obviously some reasons why people like me and so many others find that attractive, right? I think there is this concern about a kind of a tendency to devalue what is worldly that people are associating with their reading of Christianity. And again, I think that's already too simplistic, right? But this idea that the kind of, you know, the body is sort of to be abandoned, right? Tamed and disciplined as much as possible, so that the body is fallen, maybe this kind of this portrayal of bodily life and materiality as fallen in the Christian tradition, which I think then people associate with a certain kind of use of the natural world for human ends, right? So they associate this devaluing of the material world with a host of ecological ills. And that was just, once I started reading more and more of Jainism, which is so overtly, an ecological religion that then whose contemporary practitioners speak at length about animal ethics and ecology and environmental philosophy. And I thought, maybe dualism isn't the problem, right? I mean, how could dualism be the problem I mean, the punchline here, I'll tell you what I think the problem is, racism. I mean, I think if we're going to blame Europe for anything, right? If we're going to critique the West for anything, I think it is the racialization of dualistic categories that turns them poisonous at a certain specific point in European history. And that's a future research project there. But I think it is specifically in the 1800s, there's a kind of an emerging pseudoscience of race, right, that comes on the scene in Europe. And you get pre-existing dualistic categories that are then racialized. And I think that's where it turns particularly pernicious. Um, I don't really know what to do with that yet. That's my instinct. That's my instinct about what this is all about, but I haven't really done the research. But yeah, I mean, people just, I think, have associated dualism in the Western context with a specific way of devaluing nature and devaluing the body. Um, when I think that, I think relevant to this question, if they knew more about other traditions, they would actually see that dualisms are quite prevalent, including in many traditions that do not contribute to the same ecological ills. Yeah, thanks.
As someone who's immersed always in both yoga philosophy, Sankhya yoga, and Jain philosophy, you're speaking my language, and I'm sure the language of so many in the audience as well. So yeah, thank you for lifting up these alternative dualisms in ways that may not be so evident in the work that we all do. So yeah, that's great. There is another question about kind of the crisis of overconsumption from Soham Shah that I think maybe both of you might be able to answer, but I think it speaks sort of to Professor Dunn's presentation about hungry ghosts. And it says, in light of the global crisis of overconsumption, can modern technologies that forcibly reduce consumption be understood as useful tools for ethical living, or do they undermine the spiritual value of voluntary restraint? For example, how should we evaluate weight loss drugs that massively suppress food consumption or bioengineered ticks that make people allergic to red meat? So it's a question, I suppose, of using technology to fix the problems or doing it ourselves through spiritual practice, which is also simultaneously transformative.
Yeah, I would also be very against biohacking like that. That just sounds really very, very wrong, very dystopian. Um, I think with both Jainism and Buddhism, restraint has ethical force because it's chosen, because it is a chosen path. In Buddhism, karma is all about intention. So if we're trying to biohack people so that they have tics when they try to eat red meat, I think that would short circuit the karmic process. Um, Practices tied to Mahavir's aim are really all about intention, discipline, and awareness. And if consumption drops out only because of external constraint, then we're in trouble. Outcomes matter. I'm not opposed to technological solutions, but this is why I'm really trying to think deeply, not just about my own tradition, but a community of all our sacred traditions. Like I really do. Maybe it's a kind of quixotic sort of dream that I have, but if we put our combined heads together and we start trying to solve the big issues, I really do believe that we can come up with some communities-based solutions. And the other thing that I wanted to bring out is that this is exactly what lived and living traditions do. We reinvent ourselves. We stay as rooted as we can within our texts. We try as much as possible to remain faithful to our ancient paths, but at the same time, we've got to meet the needs in the everyday. And so, like, I think there's sometimes an assumption about, engaged Buddhism or engaged Jainism. I'm not sure if there's a term in engaged Jainism, but, to try and rethink liberation through modern justice issues. I think that's great. I think that's exactly what living traditions should be doing. In my own tradition, there was talk recently in Karlsruhe, WCC, about what someone proposed to be a Zacchaeus tax, which is an enforced tax on wealthy people. And again, I would say I think that actually short circuits what we're trying to do karmically and ethically. So anyway, for what it's worth, there's my answer.
Thank you, Professor Dunn. And maybe I'll take one more question for you, Professor Kalmanson, unless you wanted to respond to that one. There was another question for you in the
Maybe I'll
chat.
try the next. That's a tough one. So maybe tell me what the other question is.
Sure, yeah. Just we started a few minutes late here, so one more question. It's from Jessica Zeus, who says, "Dr. Collinson, I greatly appreciate the nuanced analysis of why and how the question of monotheism, dualism do not have much analytical mileage. I wonder what would be some more useful ways to engage different philosophical traditions."
That's also a hard question. Although I will say, I mean, that's part of what drove the most recent book. And I won't say I have all the answers there, but part of the book's project was simply saying, maybe I set aside everything I think I know about philosophy of religion, and maybe I don't use any of its language, right? Maybe I don't talk about theological proofs or positivistic language analysis or even like the phenomenological experience, of religion. Just all the methodologies of philosophy as I know them, I set those aside and I just look at how other traditions have interacted with each other. So a lot of the book is about like intra-Asian philosophical discourses, right? So that's why I was looking at Samkhya, right? That's why I was looking at its relationship to non-dualist positions in the Gita and like trying to work out exactly what was at stake for these different thinkers. And for example, I think what's at stake in the South Asian context are not these questions about the nature of God. I mean, that sort of obsesses theologians in the European context, right? And it generates the problem of evil, right? What is the nature of this supreme being who is all loving, all knowing, and all powerful? And how does this sort of explain things? Whereas the question really is, how many cosmic fundamentals do you posit in the South Asian context, right? Do you posit six like the Jains? Do you posit three like Madhvacharya? And so some traditions do posit a supreme being who is one of the constituents of reality. And I think again, just that was when I first started researching the book, and I thought, like yes, we can still talk about this kind of single supreme being, and yet it has nothing to do with the way we think the issues of monotheism are framed. If we just sort of set aside what we think we know about philosophy of religion, then dig into the methodologies internal to different traditions. So my position in that book was just trying to be a good student of other traditions so that I'm not so much the researcher bringing the methodology to the content, but I'm looking internally to the traditions that I'm reading about and learning about and saying, what were their methodologies, right? How did they talk about each other? So positions like Anekantavada are a paradigm case of like, how does one tradition look at the traditions with whom it disagrees, and come up with ways to talk together and philosophize together. So that I think is one answer, right? And it goes back to Puit's point about greater historical context, just knowing more about what was internal to traditions before we bring in the methodologies that we think are the most appropriate for the research that we're doing, right? To think about what other philosophers in the past from other traditions, methodologically, what were they doing, right? And how were they framing discourses?
Absolutely, I think that's so important for doing this kind of comparative theology, going and seeing the way that they were thinking and how it can inform us, perhaps in the present, with these ongoing projects. I want to thank you both. I realize it went very quickly, and but we were able to get some Q&A in there. And thank you both for taking the time to put together the presentations and showcase again some more of the work in this dialogue with Asian traditions as we've framed it here in this panel that will be in this wonderful new book, Jainism and Comparative Theology. We look forward to working with you again, and we will now pivot into the next panel. Thank you, Professor Kalmanson and Professor Dunn.